certainly have fears that there is a serial killer at loose in Perth.
Sarah Spears, Jane Rimmer, Ciara Glennon.
And every time you saw a young girl walking by, you think, oh God, is she going to be the next victim?
Now, one man stands accused.
If police are right and Edwards is the Claremont serial killer, he's been hiding in plain sight for 20 years.
According to the state, Ciara Glennon was either subdued or restrained and hidden in the footwell of Bradley Edwards' car while he moved her from one location to another. Welcome to day 88 of Claremont in Conversation. Natalie Bonjolo, Tim Clark and Ali Pham with you today. So I guess again today in her closing submissions, Ms Barbagallo really painted a disturbing picture of Ciara's final hours, didn't she?
Oh, absolutely. We heard stuff today that I think she probably elaborated on things that had happened, because certainly, Tim, some of those things I hadn't heard before. It was a bit more graphic, let's put it that way.
Yeah, it was more Ms Barbagallo, as we said yesterday, bringing the strands together, but she went some steps further than that today and asked Justice Hall to come to the conclusions that she then suggested to him were open to him from the evidence. And one of those, as you mentioned right at the top, Nat, was the fact that in Ciara's hair was one of these carpet fibres that were said to match to the cabin or the footwell of Mr Edwards' car, and if not his car, then certainly a VS series Holden Commodore. And the conclusion that Ms Barbagallo said that could be reached and should be reached from that was that because these fibres were tough, they were durable, they were made to be durable and didn't shed very easily, then the most likely scenario was that Ciara's head or hair or both were in direct contact with that carpet, and that would mean, of course, that her head was on the floor of the car, and from that, Ms Barbagallo said that you can assume that she'd been subdued and was basically stuffed into the footwell of that car to be hidden from view while she was being taken. And obviously we know where she ended up, was in that bush grave in Eglinton.
Yeah, I mean, it was actually just really confronting language and imagery that she was using. And I guess, you know, we had listened to so many weeks of fibre evidence, but to hear that fibre evidence being used to explain how these women were abducted was, it was actually quite confronting. She
did use certainly a lot more descriptive passages, I guess, to describe their final hours. And Tim, I was surprised at the lock of hair, which maybe I wasn't concentrating, but I hadn't heard before that was a separate piece. She called it pristine, that was actually found near the body, that was separated from her hair, which she described as being cut with a sharp object by the perpetrator.
Yeah, Tim, can you talk us through these details? Because I must admit, I missed this during the trial as well. Can you just talk us through exactly what Ms Barbagallo said about RH17 today?
Yeah, well, I think we all did, Nat, because there was eyebrows raised in unison when we heard this from Ms Barbagallo today. So our long-time listeners will remember RH17. That was a very important exhibit because it was a pristine hair sample taken from Ciara in situ in Eglinton. So this was before any examinations had been done, before the hair mass had been removed in the post-mortem. This was a piece of hair taken at the site. Now, we had, it would appear, wrongly assumed that it was cut by one of the forensic staff, by Dr. Margolius, perhaps the pathologist, and then placed into this yellow top container. But Ms Barbagallo made it very clear today that that piece of hair that became RH17 was actually detached completely from Ciara's head in situ. So it would appear, and what we presume now from that, is that in the act of being attacked by this knife that made such huge savage cuts in the back of her head, the frenzy was such that it actually also
cut the hair,
cut this piece of hair in the process, but the piece of hair had then stayed in the precinct or in the vicinity of the body such that it could be clearly seen and taken and placed in this pot. And as Ms. Barbagallo said, we did see a picture of it. And it wasn't just one or two strands. It's a lock of hair, more than 100 strands of hair. So you can imagine, and it again brings into very visceral terms what happened to Ciara on that night and in the final minutes and hours of her death, of her life that led to her death. We've heard about the wounds, of course, but just the fact that that knife was so sharp and swung in such a way that it was able to cut her hair as well as her neck, just again brings into focus the barbarity of what happened to her in 1997.
I think she probably emphasised that today because she was trying to debunk the defence's claims that any of this evidence has been contaminated, and she had to go to lengths to say, well, this wasn't a lock of hair that had been touched by anybody because it was separate. So it was the lock of hair that contained the crucial fibres. So that's why we got, I think she elaborated a bit more on that, and that's why we presumed that it was, as Tim said, done at the gravesite by one of the forensic guys, but today she made it quite clear, no, it was the attacker. And that was, I believe, the first time, because I'm sort of, as Tim said, we were all, what, so that came quite clear today because she wanted to show that none of the forensic guys had touched it afterwards that could have contaminated it. It was there lying by her body.
And I guess this might have been a little bit of a grey area for us because of the fact that this was that point in time when the video obviously needed its battery changed, and so the collection of that hair wasn't taped.
Correct, yes. It was logged and it was labelled and it was on all the lists, but for whatever reason, that, by hook or by crook or by luck, or by bad luck, that piece of evidence being collected wasn't actually on the video because there was a few minutes of gap where the video operator at the time was actually changing the battery on the camera. And so, perhaps that's where our confusion came in. But it was certainly made very clear by Ms. Barbagallo today, and Justice Hall asked her to reiterate, so you're saying that it was cut at both ends, and she said yes. It was not cut post-mortem. It appeared to be cut in the act of Ciara being killed.
Yeah, and Ms. Barbagallo also used the fibre evidence to summarise the final hours of Jane Rimmer's life as well. So how did she tie that together?
Well, again, it was the type of fibre that was in Jane's hair or found in Jane's hair later that tied her, she said, to a certain area of the car, and the one that was in Jane's case was the boot. And again, this was the specific type of carpet that was used to cover the boot and the back of the seat. And she said, because that's in Jane's hair, the assumption can be fairly made that at some point on that last night of her life, Jane was in the boot of that car and her hair was in contact with that carpet. And it goes to Ali's point and your point, Nat. When the fibre evidence was being rolled out, it was very technical, it was very dry, it was very, very long. But you can see why now that the prosecution spent so much time taking so much care to identify the parts of the car, not just the car, but the parts of the car that those fibres were said to come from, because now, right at the end, they can paint this picture for Justice Hall of not only can we say that the girls were very likely in that car, but we can say with, rare certainty on the evidence that Ciara's head was in the footwell and Jane's head was in the boot. Yeah. And that's, perhaps where their final journeys ended. Yeah,
it really does come, sharply into focus, doesn't it, when it's tied together in that way. She also, Ms. Barbagallo also was, had a really strong crack today at the defence theories of contamination. And, I think, at one point she was saying it was preposterous.
Yes. She spent quite a bit of time, I think, rebutting any claims. She's trying to cover every area she thinks that the defence might come in with, not only contaminated, but as Justice Hall said, the pre-existing theory that some of these fibres could have been there from various places they'd been, from various other people that they'd brushed up on. So she covered that very, very carefully as well. And I think probably her strongest point today, talking about the fibre and the DNA match, was the Karrakatta victim. To me, that's the big key, the big link.
Yeah, and that's where coincidence maybe stretches out to absurdity, as you said, and that is the suggestions made during the fibre evidence in the cross-examinations that possibly there might have been on the 2 nights that Jane and Ciara were both in the Continental Hotel, a Telstra worker there that they might have rubbed up against. But then you take it one step further and say, well, okay, but how did the Telstra fibres, which we say they are, get on the shorts of the Karrakatta rape victim, which were basically seized almost immediately after the attack, or certainly in the hour or two after the attack? Was she supposed to have rubbed up against the Telstra worker on her night out as well? And what are the chances of that over from 95 to 96 to 97? All of those 3 women that didn't know each other, had no connection to Telstra whatsoever through their work, their family, anything. And all those 3 fibres appear on all those 3 victims. And what's the one thing we do know? The person who attacked the young lady in Karrakatta is Bradley Robert Edwards. He's admitted it. And the other thing we know is he worked for Telstra. So you're right, Nat, what Ms. Barbagallo said today, and she did it with an element of humour, I suppose, given the seriousness of it, was just try to paint. So she painted scenarios from her point of view of what could be said, and then she painted the reverse scenarios. Well, okay, Your Honour, if you want to take it so far, is it possible then that Jane and Ciara both travelled in this mystery car in this VS series Commodore in the days leading up to both their murders? Then they rubbed up against a Telstra worker on the nights of both their murders, months and months and months apart. And then she pointed to all the other similarities, as well as the fact that they both disappeared on a weekend from Claremont. They were both dumped in remote locations. They were both left basically in the middle of nowhere, with in areas that they should never have been found. And then, as we've said, layered it all up, which to come to the conclusion, which will probably be tomorrow, is that there is no other scenario, Your Honour. Bradley Edwards killed them.
And I guess this idea that, this coincidence thing, it is such a strong idea, because when you think of it like that, and this is almost like Damien's yesterday talking about, the gymnastics that you perform in this. And again, it's sort of like a double backflip with a twist, taking it in this different direction and making you think of it in another way. Yeah.
And Justice Hall, in his rare intellectual way, summed it up today by using the analogy of Occam's razor, which is a theory that goes to the fact of something is, the most logical conclusion is the one that you don't have to make the least amount of assumptions to get there. So if you wanted to get to, in Miss Barbagallo's case, her argument today was, well, look, if you wanted to get to a scenario where both these girls were not killed by Mr. Edwards, then you'd have to make myriad of assumptions that they rubbed up against Telstra people, that they somehow come into contact with the same car, and then you take the Karrakatta victim as well. The assumptions just become too preposterous, to use her words, for it to be anything other than the scenario the prosecution want Justice Hall to find, which is there was one man.
It's been amazing, hasn't he, Justice Hall, with his questioning? It's so precise and asking for clarification and confirmation, and what is the other suggestion? That it's almost like he's doing the defence lawyers thinking ahead of time. And he's been quite, a lot of her stuff's interrupted and by Justice Hall, picking up on minute points, but saying, is this right, and what's the possibility of that? So he's covering absolutely every point.
Was Ms Barbagallo asked by Justice Hall about the possibility and the theories of contamination at the crime scenes?
Yes. She went there herself as she needed to, I suppose, because that is another theory that might be postulated as to how those fibres got there. But again, she pointed out, well, none of the operatives had this car. They all wore different sort of uniforms that didn't have this type of blue polyester fibre. She did point to the common attendees at both crime scenes, and there were about half a dozen of the same people that attended the crime scene at Wellard, where Jane was, and Eglinton, where Ciara was. But again, she then went on to stress, but they weren't wearing Telstra work pants. They weren't in some cases weren't even wearing any blue polyester. They all drove different cars. If they did get there in a car, then this would have to be the scenario. They would have had to brought the fibres with them. Then they would have had to, from the Holden Commodore, then they would have had to endure it for about 3 hours before. This is Dr. Clive Cook, the pathologist, who said he possibly might have got to one of the crime scenes in a Holden Commodore, but then it would have been 3 hours before he was close to the head of the girls, and then that fibre wouldn't have had to have flown off him through the air and settled on. So it was really trying to paint the most preposterous picture that she could about the possibility of contamination. Now, I'm sure Mr. Dovich, when he gets his turn, whether it be tomorrow or the following day, will stress that maybe it's not as impossible as Ms. Barbagallo makes out, and then of course it'll be up to Justice Hall to make his conclusions and come to a verdict.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, right now, at this point in time, it sounded like it was a very, very strong summary of all of that fibre evidence and its tie-in. So then this afternoon, the argument moved to propensity, and Ms. Barbagallo posed the question, so was he just a rapist, or was he a rapist and a murderer?
Which is the question that we've been posing to ourselves for 88 and a half days now, Nat.
Yeah.
But this again was Miss Barbagallo going further than she's ever been able to go, really, because you can't put a scenario to a witness. You put questions to a witness and they tell you the story.
Yes.
But then Miss Barbagallo will take the entirety of those witnesses and come up with a story that she says it is open for Justice Hall to find. And this was compelling, and again disturbing today, this afternoon, because she said, from the evidence of that rape victim at Karrakatta, it is open for Justice Hall to conclude that not only was he out to sexually attack her, but he was out to kill her. She says it is open on the evidence that presented that he wanted, and he being Bradley Edwards, wanted to murder that young teenager that night. And she got there by pointing Justice Hall to the end of that attack. When it was over, we know that Mr. Edwards picked up the young lady, put her in some bushes, walked off, came back, picked her up from those small copse of bushes and placed her in a larger bushes, but very close by. At this time, the young lady was pretending to be unconscious. She wasn't unconscious, but she was pretending to be. And Ms. Barbagallo said, well, think about that. If he would just wanted to attack her, why wouldn't he just leave? Why would he go, come back again and hide her, for all intents and purposes, in these bushes? And she said the conclusion that could be drawn is that he was hiding her so he could come back later and kill her. And the motive for that, she said, would be identification, because at some point during the attack, Mr. Edwards has taken the hood off that young lady that he put on when he abducted her, and that would go to identification. And then there was also the physical material that he was likely to have left behind during the attack, which would also go to identification. And this was the point, Ali, that Justice Hall really started testing that theory with Miss Barbagallo and asking quite blunt questions, really, as to, well, is it possible for me to find out? Why would you say that? Isn't there some other scenario why he would have left her there?
The question that's really divided the legal fraternity, just talking around them, does a rapist stay as a rapist, or does a rapist, is that his modus operandi and he only does that, or does he, in fact, can he graduate to a serial killer? But also, I think too, you could point out that with the rape victim, she never screamed. She didn't do anything. So he probably felt, as you say, he had a bit more time. There was no immediate screaming that would have attracted attention. She was very quiet. She played, sort of dead.
Tim, so when Justice Hall said to Ms. Barbagallo, is there, how can you be so certain that he was coming back for her, that his intention was to kill her? Could there not have been some other reason for the various way that it happened? Did she respond to that?
Yeah, well, and she said, well, you just look at the evidence, you look at the logical conclusion as to the motive as to why he would do that. And so the picture they painted was of Mr. Edwards, obviously, as we know, abducting this young woman, putting her in the car, driving her around, taking her to Karrakatta. But then she raised the two pieces of evidence or witness accounts from security guards in and around that cemetery on that night. And if we remember way back, there was a security guard that did at Hollywood Hospital, saw the van, but there were also two security guards actually patrolling the cemetery at that time, one with a torchlight and one with this sort of buzzer thing that went round, and he had to clock in and clock off to show that he'd done his rounds. And Miss Barbagallo postulated, well, it could be that Mr. Edwards was disturbed in the midst of that attack by these two security guards. He's stopped. He's got spooked. He's finished what he was doing, picked up the young woman, put her down, walked away, thought better of it. There's security around. I don't want to be caught. Come back, dumped her in the bushes again, and gone away again. With the intention of coming back later because he thought she was unconscious to kill her. But when he has come back, and the theory about him coming back in the van was taken then to the Hollywood Hospital security guard, who said he spotted a van with a Telstra logo on it that night. He said, or Miss Barbagallo said, that could have been Mr. Edwards coming back in the van to try and find the young lady, but she wasn't unconscious after all. She managed to rescue herself, get to the hospital and escape. So, look, I'm pretty sure Mr. Yavish is going to point to various possible holes in that story and say, look, that is just way off beam. You can't really come to that conclusion. But Ms. Barbagallo's put it out there, and it was something that we'd all thought about.
Yeah.
I think that's fair to say, but we hadn't heard it in such graphic terms until this afternoon.
Definitely. And was there any reaction from Mr. Edwards in relation to that today?
He was well. Yeah, I was watching him when that postulation was being made, and he was paying more attention then than I think he has done throughout the whole 2 days so far. He's mostly head down, scribbling away, but he was looking quite intently across the courtroom when that theory was being put, and yeah, I wondered whether that shocked him as much as it possibly shocked everyone else. Was
the courtroom full today?
It wasn't as crowded as it has been. No, a little less. I think probably people think it's winding up. Certainly not the crowds that it has been for the first 2 days.
Mm. Right. Yeah, but still, I mean, a huge amount of interest in that, that's not surprising, I suppose, given that we really are getting to the pointy end now, and you're getting a fair and fast summary of everything that's gone before.
That's right. So tomorrow will most likely be Ms. Barbagallo's final day. Do you know what else to expect tomorrow?
No, she just said that she expected to wind up either by lunchtime or just shortly afterwards. So presumably the defence will be on their feet right straight away.
Yeah, which will be the end of a very, very long innings for Miss Barbagallo, 88 days, and most of that time spent on her feet or certainly directing traffic from her chair. She joked with me before her illness that just keep an eye on me when I actually sit down after my closings, because you might see a puff of the cheeks and an exhalation of because it's just a mammoth.
She said she was talking as fast as she can to me today. She said, and I said, well, we were all praying for your speedy recovery because we didn't want it to go on any longer. But she said, no, she said, I'm going through it. And she's really sort of going through it quite fast. Aware of the time, I think, too.
Yeah, the level of detail is absolutely extraordinary. No question about that. Well, before we go, we thought we'd let you know that our producer Kate Ryan has put together a bit of a catalogue of previous podcasts, and these are the podcasts that relate specifically to Ms. Barbagallo's closing submissions. So some of the detail we obviously can't include in the podcast, but if you wanted to go back and take a listen, the episodes you would need to look out for, if you're looking for DNA refresher, it's episodes 35 to 59. So that really was a very long time. If you want that in a condensed form, episode 35 was a lesson in DNA. If you're looking for fibre episodes, they are episodes 60 to 81. So breaking those down, episode 61 is the FBI connection, episode 65 is the car seizure, and episode 81 is the very strong chance that Ciara was in Edward's car. The information on the Huntingdale attack is episode 10, the Karrakatta attack is episode 11, and the Hollywood Hospital attack is episode 7. So you'll be able to find all those details there. Thank you both for today. We'll see you back in court tomorrow. Almost there, at the very pointy end now.
Yes, nearly there, Nat. It's been a marathon, not a sprint. I think that's fair to say.
Absolutely. And thank you for your company. Ms. Barbagallo should wrap her closing tomorrow before Mr. Jovic takes the stand. Join us then for day 89 of Claremont in Conversation as this marathon trial draws ever closer to its final conclusion. Chat tomorrow.
This podcast is hosted by Natalie Bongiolo, produced by Kate Ryan, and recorded in the studios of 7 West Media. Sign up for daily emails and all the latest on the Claremont trial at thewest.com.au. And if local news delivered differently appeals to you, tune into WA's newest morning show, The West Live with Jenna Clark. It's talkback radio, but without the interruptions. Listen live weekdays from 8:45 a.m. on thewest.com.au or catch up with the podcast.